My name is Claire. I'm project manager at MTech, and I oversee a portfolio of health tech projects. So we have a team of hardware engineers, firmware engineers, some developers, some data scientists, and researchers. And together we work on the development of VR headsets, some algorithms, and some applications. So as Tom said, my background is in video games. And this is how I really started learning about user experience and accessibility. And tonight I'm presenting with Marge.
Hi, I'm Marge Lang. I'm a user researcher. Been working for about 20 years in UX design and research. Last summer, I started looking for opportunities to do research in VR and started going to meetups. And that's how I came across this project and met up with Claire. So I'm really, really excited to be here to talk about this, one of the most interesting projects I've ever worked on. Thanks, Thomas and Roland, for the invitation to speak, and also to Meryl for your help. Okay, so what are we talking about? Virtual reality therapy for people with facial palsy. And then we'll talk a bit about the user research process and how that applied in parts of our work, just a few examples, and then some reflections. So I hand to Claire now too.
So we'll start with talking about facial palsy a little bit. So facial palsy happens when there is some damage made to the facial nerves, and the damage can be either temporary or permanent. So the people who have facial palsy have half of the face paralyzed, most of the case, and their facial expressions are affected. So because facial expression are used in communication, when the facial expressions are deformed, it impacts people's life and social lives a lot. So 70% of the people with facial palsy will recover fully within a few weeks, but about 30% will not recover, and they will have to do some rehabilitation, so facial rehabilitation for a really long time, sometimes like a lifetime of rehabilitation. They will have to practice daily to improve, or at least to not get worse. So there are several challenges for people with facial palsy. So one of the biggest challenge is to understand how their face works, because they cannot feel some part of their face and they cannot move it. So they don't know if their muscle is activating or not. Sometimes they develop some involuntary movement. So in the picture here, you can see that the lady, when the lady is smiling, one of her eye closes, and she cannot control this movement of the eye. And because of all this contraction in the face can become tight or painful. So the rehabilitation program is about massaging the face, doing some muscle relaxation, and practicing some really small and controlled expressions. So to get better, they have to do some rehabilitation every day. And they do have to practice really correctly, because incorrect practice can mean making the condition worse. So one of the things they need to learn is to relax some muscles that overactivate, and to control some muscles that should not activate. And this is difficult because this muscle activation is sometimes invisible to the naked eye. So if you look at the picture on the screen, you can think that the muscle which is above the lip, the one with the green arrow, is weak and doesn't move up, when actually it's the muscle below the lip in red that is overactivating, and it's pulling all the other muscles down. People with facial palsy don't really like to practice in front of the mirror because it can remind them of a trauma, or just remind them of their facial palsy. And the progress is rapid during the first weeks of recovery, but after months, it can be really slow. So it's discouraging when you cannot see progress in your practice. So how can MTech help these people with facial palsy? So we are developing some VR headsets that can collect and interpret some biometrics data. So biometrics data are, for example, heart rate or facial expressions. So, well, it's muscle activation that then turn into facial expression. So we have several sensors on the headset, and they measure activation of the cheek muscles, eyebrows, corrugator, and muscle around the eyes. And we also have the small rectangular sensor for heart rate. So when the people have this headset on their face, they can see muscle activation in real time. So we can show that to therapists or to patients, and then we can teach them which muscles they should relax or which muscle they should maybe retrain. And because we can save the data, we can also show some improvement over time. So if the progress is slow, maybe we can show them that the level of activation becomes more normal with time. So when we started the project, we talked to therapists, we did some focus groups, we did a design sprint for a week with the company to try to have the first prototype. And at that point, we decided that we needed more support from user research, and that's when we started working with Marge. And Marge is now going to talk to you about some user research process.
Okay, so just to introduce human-centered design for those who might not be familiar with the concept, it's basically an approach to design that starts with the people that you're designing for. So the idea is you would speak with people and understand what their needs are, how they behave, and just more about the lives of the people who are going to be affected by solutions you're designing. So understanding their goals. In our case, our users, their goal was to improve the symmetry of their face, and also to then think about how the experience would fit into their life. And so, you know, ostensibly, these aren't people who are interested in virtual reality at all. Their goal is to improve their face. So that was another thing to bear in mind. And then from this foundation of understanding the person, the idea is your solutions are going to be tailored to their needs and bring value to their life. And as part of the approach, you might adopt certain design techniques like prototype testing and co-designing ideas together and iterating and validating as you go. So who are the users? So you've heard about people with facial palsy, and particularly the 30% who have long-term facial palsy. We also realized that our therapists were potential or secondary users to the experience, because they would be working with their patients and prescribing this kind of therapy. So we worked really closely with them. And if you are embarking on this kind of research, you know, your fastest starting point might be to talk to therapists, and they're a brilliant source of knowledge about the domain and about their patient's experience, and can give you a huge amount that you can then base your initial research questions on. Something, for example, we learned was that, you know, how therapy is done in the real world. And off the basis of that, we would need to imagine, well, how can that translate into virtual reality, which is very different. And they explained that patients might need to relax their face, you know, for 20 minutes before they even start to exercise. So that's another consideration of what happens in the steps before someone puts on a headset. We did a journey mapping exercise with the expert therapist who, this is a great technique to use, where we just had a whiteboard, great big whiteboard, and some pens, and asked the therapist questions and just drew while they spoke and plotted the experience over time of the patient and what happened on the different days and weeks that followed, their symptoms and how they felt and what therapy they might need. to really build out our idea of their experience. So when you're going to do research, you definitely need to speak to the real users after you've spoken to your experts, and they can be hard to find. So sometimes you have to really persist and work hard at it, especially when someone's condition is quite, not many people have it. So some ways we went about this was getting direct introductions from therapists, also going to Facebook and looking for Facebook groups. And, you do need to be very transparent and go directly to the admins of Facebook groups and explain what your purpose is, and they can choose to allow you or not. But that's a really great way to do shout out for research participants if they are welcoming. There's also the option of charities. So we worked with Facial Palsy UK, who had a research advert on their website. And then support groups, or there's also scientific research websites like Call for Participants that you can also approach. But it's worth the effort because the value you get from actually speaking to real people is gold. The important thing to consider before you dive in is just to do that planning and think about research ethics. So very, very important is informed consent, and your participants have the right to informed decisions about what they're going to take part in. So you need to make sure your consent form is in plain English, and it prepares them for who will be present in the research, what will be involved, and also what kind of recording methods you're planning to use. For our participants, they were very sensitive about being recorded. They didn't want their face recorded sometimes. So in some interviews, you just wouldn't have the camera on at all, and you actually don't need it. So that's another thing is to remember you don't always need to do as much as you think with that. A temptation when you start learning a lot about a subject is to think you can start telling people things, and it's very important not to advise your participants about the subject matter, but just to listen to what they say and leave the advice to the experts. Watch them, be sensitive to them. So sometimes discussing these things can bring up, difficult memories or emotion, and you need to take care of the people that you're doing research with and not push them to speak about things they're not comfortable about. We're not psychologists here. Only take the data that's necessary. Don't use video unless you need to. And be very careful to guard the data you collect, particularly where there's really sensitive topics being discussed. Just be vigilant about anonymizing things and keeping the data safe. So once all that's in place, you can get down to the really fantastic business of speaking with people and talking to them and learning from them. And then sharing what you learn. So this image on the screen here is a picture of a persona, which represents one type of our user that we had. And this is a great tool to learn about users with, especially if you have no exposure. So for me, this was created even before I arrived, and it was incredibly helpful at a glance to get an understanding of what this type of person's motivation was, what they were experiencing, and just bring to life that individual really quickly. So, for example, when you're speaking with people, you learn stuff that you wouldn't expect. So we, for example, in our case, we learned that some people were really well informed about their condition and wanted to know everything about how their muscles worked, but others were not so much. And this really affected their understanding of what we were presenting. They didn't understand muscle names. And so, the corrugator isn't something that everyone knows what it is. So we realized we would need to use less technical medical jargon when we spoke and presented information to people. So that was one example, one insight we gained. And I'm going to hand back to Claire to talk about some design constraints.
Yes, so we are talking to users, we are trying to understand what they need and what they want, but we still have some constraints with the design. So if we want to reduce the noise in the data we collect, right now we were asking our participants to not move their head too much. And also because they might have stiffness in the face or the neck, we are trying to just avoid unnecessary movement. So right now it's sat down experience and mainly looking straight. All the exercises were worked on with therapists, obviously, and the order of the practice as well. So we start with relaxation before doing any movement. And we needed to consider sensitivity to light and colors, because some people who had a brain injury that led to facial palsy might have sensitivity to light. So after considering the constraints, we developed some part of the rehabilitation program, and we ran some usability tests. So we invited some people with facial palsy to try the product, and we were observing their interactions. We were asking them to do some actions, and we were trying to see if they were understanding the rehabilitation program and if they could use the VR system easily. So facial palsy affects a really wide audience. So it can be young people or older people, women, male. So we tried with as many people we could. Because for the rehabilitation program, we need some algorithm. We also asked some participants to do data collection at the end of the usability test. So during the test, it was Marge, me, plus one participant. So I was doing all the setup, cleaning, all of the technology, and making sure that the sensors were working. And Marge was going through all the steps and questions and observing people, body language. At the end of the usability test, we conducted some interviews as well. So on the picture, you can see me with a mask and the participant in the background with the headset, putting the headset on. So for this usability test, we needed our headset with integrated sensors, a laptop that could run quite a few programs at the same time. We had a GoPro to record the full session and being able to come back to it later and maybe rewatch some section of the usability test. So on the laptop, we had a program called Air Server, and this program was casting what the users was seeing in VR. So as observer, we could see where they were in the VR scene. So webcam was recording the participant's face, quite close-ups. We also had an app called the Supervision app, and that's the MTech software that let us know if the sensors are connected, if the signals are good, and if the data is recording. And everything was recording via OBS, so it's a video capture to record all this information. And we recorded everything, so to be able to go back and re-listen to some sections or rewatch some sections, but also to share some highlights with the team. So we started usability test just before the first lockdown. And this is, we had already some rules to make sure that the place was safe. So we took really a lot of measures to make sure that everything was sanitized. We had hand sanitizer, gloves, alcohol wipes, and masks. We had all the windows open constantly, and between participants, we sprayed all the equipment and wiped everything. So when you run a usability test, there is a lot of steps and checks to be done. So with COVID, it was just additional steps. So that was for the setup. And now Marge will tell you what we tested during this test.
Okay, so what we're going to do is shortly is watch the two very short clips of parts of what we tested. And the first one you'll see is a sequence where the participant records different facial expressions, and we are measuring their muscle movement while they do that. And the second part is where they are doing a bit of the relaxation, one of the relaxation exercises. Yeah, so if you can see here, this is the recording of expression. And then there's a recording of another expression. I think the second one is a smile. And then this is the relaxation. So the participant is concentrating on the blue jar, and they are trying to relax their muscles in their face, and the bar moves down as their face relaxes. And they're in a sort of calm environment, and there would normally be audio instructions playing. Okay, so that's it. It's just repeating. So the measurements we capture in the first sequence, where they are having a neutral expression and then they smile and then they have a neutral expression, those measurements are informing the target in their relaxation exercise later. And so it's effectively something they have to do every time they put the headset on, is they do this sequence of facial expressions which then capture their baseline. We referred to it as calibration. And so it's a really important activity. You can imagine if you were using this every day, you would tire of having to do a long sequence. So we were really interested in making this as streamlined as possible. And what we noticed during the testing was that it was possibly not as swift and smooth as we might have liked. And we saw that when people were managing to do it, but they were having to concentrate a lot, it seemed, and pause. And when we talked about it, they weren't too negative, but they didn't really fly through it, as it were. And so we had a look at it and realized that the information was a bit scattered on the page, with instructions at the top, along the bottom, and with the dancing robot. And so we had to think, well, what would be the simplest way for us to make improvements to this? So I sat with the tech artist, and we discussed what the users had been saying, and we talked about some solutions. And then he drew these really rough sketches for two different routes, just in Adobe XD. And then I very quickly tested those two routes with people on video calls using screen share. So not using virtual reality at all. Just showing them some very simple interactive prototypes. And through that testing, we were able to refine the language being used, make sure that there was as few words as possible, and that the sequence was really a lot smoother for them. So that was a really helpful way to move forward. So on reflection, with the research, one of the things I'd recommend is just be lean when you can, and realize you don't have to do everything in virtual reality. You can learn a lot using leaner methods. Really big is to observe people. You know, as Claire was saying, there were two of us in the room, and you have to really watch, because an interesting thing with virtual reality is that, unlike other usability testing where you would use a speak aloud protocol and get someone talking as they look at stuff, you couldn't really do that, because they were so immersed in the experience and concentrating on the task that we couldn't get them to talk at the same time. And so we had to wait till the end and watch and try to figure out what they were doing and where they might be having difficulty, and then ask them at the end about it. So it's really key to be watching everything really carefully. And then look after people, particularly if you're involved in medical research or things that are personal. You really need to take great care about how you speak to people, and take their needs first. And finally, just to bring your team along with you as you learn insights and make sure that everyone is invested in the people you design for better outcome.
So on my side, we were trying to develop hardware, firmware, software, algorithm, and therapy all at the same time. And it was really difficult sometimes to pinpoint where problems were coming from. So I would say one thing at a time would be better for next time. Simpler is better. We spent some time trying to design some fancy things to start with, but what we really need to master at the beginning are the mechanics of the exercises and of the therapy. So really simple things were working really well. It's also easy to get carried away with new ideas. So user researchers are usually good at bringing the focus back in the team. And also, I would say that we learned that we should collaborate with content developer later on to improve user engagement. We learn a lot by observing and interviewing users. So usability tests are quite tiring. Like it's a lot of activity and in a short period of time. But it's a really good way to spot flaws and issues. So I will join Marge on her point to share with the team. So it can be a really, really powerful to show the recordings to the team and share some of the feedback. So if you want to find more about MTech headset, you can go on our website and feel free to contact us as well. You've got the contact on the slide. So thank you for joining us, and we will take your questions.
Wow, thank you all so much. This was awesome presentation. I just want to also acknowledge I really knew nothing about facial palsy or thinking about how technology can be used with this. So this is really cool as someone that works in accessibility for many years. I think what you all are working on, it's really, really cool and really interesting. I'm going to start off with a question, and then we'll take questions here in the audience. But my first question was basically on the one thing that was mentioned was that you have to be careful about incorrect exercise can make the condition worse. And I was curious, like with just in the practice or the rehabilitation, like could you give an example of one? Like would that be something that the system can detect or point out that you're doing an exercise? Like how would it be able to know that you're doing exercise incorrectly?
So you might not know when you do the practice that you are doing something incorrectly, but you might find out weeks later, because if you have overworked a muscle that was working normally, but you didn't realize, you will create some new imbalance in your face when you already have this unbalance in the face. So you don't want to create more of it by working and training muscles that should not be activating more. So that's an example. Or you can, the advice of the therapist is at the beginning, learn to relax your face. Don't practice expressions, because again, you can just retrain the wrong muscle. So you won't know it if you don't talk to a therapist or if you can't feel muscle activation in your face.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, and so that goes into the two examples you showed in the video, that one of the exercises to do a smile facial expression, and one is to do a totally relaxed. Yeah, it's really cool. Thank you.
I have a question over here. People can hear me. I'm not sure my mic is.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yes, sir.
Okay, awesome.
I can't hear you.
I'm just really curious. So I saw that you had the sensor rig kind of hooked up to the VR headset, which looked really awesome. And you mentioned that when we were having trouble with it, you did try doing it just over video conference. I'm curious, I guess, it seems like the headset was kind of a useful platform for those sensors, but that going through the exercises was possible without having the actual immersive environment. Was the main benefit of the immersive environment that just intense focus you're talking about, where people are hard to be interrupted, or if not, what would you say were the other benefits of doing it in VR?
So the project started a few years ago with some glasses, which could read facial expression as well. But they were looking at skin movement instead of EMG. So this new technology now is looking at muscle activation and not skin movement. But it's true that we can do the same with an open face. So we also have this technology of an open face, which allows you to do the exercise in front of a computer instead of in VR. But in VR, as you said, you really control the environment and you can take the time to focus on your exercises. So VR is not required, but it's a good way to immerse yourself in your therapy, doing your exercises, and for us to really control what they see for their therapy.
Gotcha.
I think you mentioned too, one of the feedback was that several participants didn't necessarily want to see their face or have their face displayed. So is that something where in the virtual avatar, like that helps alleviate that, where they don't feel as much pressure if it's not their actual face, or is that anything that was studied?
I guess that's a byproduct of the fact that they're wearing the headset and they're not having to look at their face. Maybe not an intent or a reason for using the VR, but a helpful byproduct.
Interesting.
There is maybe in the future when we get better at producing avatars that look like you and don't look too awkward, we are thinking of giving the patients their own avatar and practice their own expression so they could re-see their face. But right now it looks a little bit, the uncanny valley when you have your avatar, but it's like you, but not exactly like you. And in the end, it's more awkward than anything else. But we would like to do that in the future, being able to upload your own avatar and then practice your expression using your own face.
That's cool.
Mm-hmm. Right now, there is a mobile application that kind of does something similar. It records half of your face and mirror it. So you can already just practice looking at half of your face, which is mirrored. So if we could do that in VR, that would be a really great project to work on.
Could you talk about too, I might have missed this at the very beginning, but you mentioned that the people that have facial palsy and need to do rehabilitation, it's a very broad and diverse group. Is there like a certain group that it's the largest group, or like the largest cohort of people, or like the most standard user for this type of tech?
So it can happen to anyone at any time. We don't always know why people have facial palsy. Sometimes it's linked to an accident, and sometimes some people just wake up with facial palsy. But at some point we discussed who shall we target, because we can't design for everyone. So most of the time we try to target the population. And our chief scientist officer, Charles Nduka, who is also a surgeon working a lot with people with facial palsy, told us that the people who come to see therapists the most are women, and maybe a bit older women. So that's when we decided that we should, if we had to target a certain population of people with facial palsy, we would go to this population of people who do go and see therapist. But it can be really happening to anyone. There are kids. We can't really work with kids because the headset might be a bit too big. So then the sensor would not be on the right muscles on the face. So right now, yeah, its target audience is more for women, but it could work for most adult people.
And also one other question, just for the like big picture solution, is the idea that people have access to this headset when they go into see like the clinician, or is this something where they should have it at home and be doing it every day? Like, or is there a certain, what's the expectation that like patients would take the device home with them or have access to the device at home?
So we are thinking of having the same product, but for two audiences. So one for the therapist. So therapists could have their own rehabilitation program to teach their patients how to use it and maybe show them the right expressions. But ideally, we want these people to have a headset at home and practice daily. So usually therapists are trying to include the practice and link that to daily habits. So they could recommend to their patients to do some relaxation or rehabilitation program when they wash their hand or when they're in their car or something like that. When with the VR, what we might try to encourage people is to take 15 minutes a day to focus on their program, on their rehabilitation. So they would start with massaging the face because that's what usually it starts with, and then take 15 minutes with headset on to do their program.
Yeah, we had some interesting feedback where the participants would ask about the exercises and ask if the exercises in the program would be customized to them by their therapist. So there was that feeling of trust, of wanting to know that this device was giving them the correct information that they'd come to trust from a therapist. So,
I'm curious how, in terms of taking these devices and the platforms that are used to make the software and using it for this kind of rehabilitative purpose, what were some of the major kind of design and development difficulties you ran into? And if there's anything you feel like, I'm not sure if you use Unity, but if any of the platforms that you used could potentially do better to make your life easier.
So can you just rephrase your question? Sorry, I'm not sure I understood.
Yeah. So I'm wondering basically, well, first, how do you know what platform you used? Was it Unity or a different?
Yeah. It's Unity.
Yeah, Unity. Yeah. I'm curious if, I guess, was there anything that you found? One of the things we found in accessibility is, speaking of things like captions, there's not really a good system for captions in VR so far that we've seen that's kind of universal that could be applied with Unity. And so I'm wondering if you could have Unity change something to make your life easier, if there's anything that comes to mind that you would change.
That's a good question. So I think the idea is that MTech is trying to provide what Unity doesn't provide. So we are working on a SDK that everyone can integrate with. So it means that if you are developing a VR experience and you would like to use our technology, we send you the SDK and you should be able to integrate. So maybe Unity could have our SDK integrated directly, but that might be a big goal, and that would be great. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Would you think about putting it on the Unity store as something people could download from there?
guess we could, but you would still have to get the headset somehow. So that's something I would have to talk with the team. Yeah. But yeah, maybe that's something we could do in the future, having the SDK ready to download there. So as if you are using our headsets, and you can just integrate your experience with it with our SDK.
Gotcha. Yeah, because that's something I'm very interested in. Is you've done some really amazing work here, and I think we're trying to kind of understand some of the challenges that people like yourself face in making this type of research and in distributing it. And getting it into positions where it can help people. And so if you have other thoughts about that, about kind of the barriers that you've found on the way to doing that, I'd definitely be curious to hear them.
So yeah, the challenge we have is really to get quality data, so to make sure that there's no noise and that all the data we provide is good. So that's one of our challenge. But once this one is solved, then people using our SDK should have just perfect quality data.
I wanted to ask, I would be one of the patients if I would send this, where I would want to learn all the muscles, and I would be someone that's like, oh, this, if I need to know this, I would want to know this. Is that something that the software like helps educate you, or can it educate you on like the specific muscles you're using? If you were one of the people that wanted to have that kind of information.
Well, one of the screens that was in the experience that we didn't demonstrate today actually shows, this is where we learned that the muscle names weren't, dropping for some of the people, was because there was a face that would light up the different parts as your muscle activated. So people got really excited when they saw that, because they would see their cheek, a little light would flash, and they'd be like, oh, I didn't realize that's what my cheek is doing. I need that to do that less, basically. And we had the labels of those muscles were there. So some people were happy with that, and others it was just like scary, meaningless situation. So I guess that would be a design challenge in figuring out how to cater to both people.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and like you said, I guess you have to consider people that want that and people that don't want that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Any other questions here? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Actually, Mark.
I was going to say the therapists really want the patients to know those things. The therapists want to use that kind of language, but you can't force it on people.
Oh, interesting. So the therapist's design goal would be that they want that information to be part of it.
They want the patients to understand how their face works. They want the patients to engage with that level of detail, because the more the patient understands, theoretically, the more, the better they'll be with their therapy. But some people just don't want that.
Thank you both for being here tonight. We really appreciate the presentation.
Thank you for the invite. It was great to be here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much.
Great.
Shall we?
So we'll end the stream, and then we can just kind of come down now to the